Welcome to the first episode of Andaman Nicobar Collective. Its objective of this platform is to discuss and examine the issues pertaining to the future of the Andaman and Nicobar Island from a perspective of academic rigor, as well as listen to the various voices of the indigenous communities and the settler groups itself. So we have with us today Professor Vishwajit Pandya, Dr. Madhumita Mazumdar, Dr. Manish Chandi, and I'm Anirban. And we'll just do a quick round of introduction where we can just introduce each other so we know who we are and our relationship to the island. So I'll ask Dr. Pandya to do a quick introduction of himself.
My name is Vishwajit Pandya, and thanks Anirban for the session and the forthcoming session. Just something to add. I came to the island as a student, as a PhD student, to do my research in 1983, and since then I have been hooked onto this island, and sort of expanded from studying the Ongis to parts of Jarawa and the islanders who have settled there, and then finally to the last or the end of the island sequence, which ends in Great Nicobar, which will be the focus of today's session. And I look forward to adding more things from the perspective of understanding past and present to understand this island and bring in a different perspective rather than just one top-down perspective. Thank you.
Dr. Mazumdar?
Hello, I'm Dr. Mazumdar. I'm a historian by training, but with a special interest in the history of science and technology. I came to Andamans only almost by chance, but after several visits to the place, I began to realize how much the islands were used both in the colonial times and in present times as a sort of laboratory for trying out different ways of making the island space productive and for generating revenue from a very intractable terrain, and in some ways by deployments of all kinds of instruments at hand to both tame the indigenous people and to tame the island landscape. Now, with this particular idea in mind, I have been interested in developmental projects in the Andaman Islands, both from the colonial times and present. And I hope that we can all of us together bring some perspective on the present trajectories of development in the islands. So thank you, Anirban, for introducing all of us to the collective. And I look forward to more productive conversations in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Madhumita. Manish?
Yeah, thank you, Anirban, for bringing us all together and starting this session as a collective. I am Manish Chandi. I came to the islands in '95, and I came just after my post-graduation studies with a view of not doing any more academics ever in my life. But eventually, the islands itself and the interest that I can have developed in the islands drew me back to academia to a certain extent. And I've been working with the non-governmental organization for the longest time, about 25 years in the islands, called the Andaman Nicobar Environment Team. I quit. I am on sabbatical from last year onwards, but my interests are very diverse, and I've indulged in a lot of various, largely socio-environmental kind of projects and activities and academics in the islands, largely to do with even serving the islands earlier initial days for crocodiles, sea turtles, avifauna as well, and also work with some of the local settler communities in Middle Andaman and South Andaman. Eventually, when I was sent to the Nicobars, my first visit was '96 to Great Nicobar, and ever since Great Nicobar kind of held a great interest for my own work. But I began working in Great Nicobar and Little Nicobar, particularly from 2000, 2001 onwards, and I've stuck on. So that's where my interest lies. But most of my work, at least the academic work I've done in the Nicobar Islands, largely has to do with sharing systems, social ecological sharing systems, or sharing resources, which is still my kind of area of interest. And I believe it holds a cue and a key to a lot of their social and environmental problems, because as islanders, they have actually already tested the waters by themselves much before any administration came over and figured out how to kind of share resources on the island and manage their own resources. That's where my interest stems from. Apart from which, yes, I've been working with Professor Pandya and a couple of others in the Tribal Research Institute, and with a lot of other colleagues who have come on various other projects related to species, both plant and animal species in the islands. So that's where I stand, and that's me.
Thanks, Manish. I have been involved with the island since 2005 post-tsunami, initially more as an observer and a person who was doing the recording of initially the Onge shelter design project. But over a period of time since then, my association has grown, and like all of us, I think once you step onto the island, it kind of sucks you in. So today it has grown from not just being a recorder and an observer of the various communities, but also a kind of specific interest into the telling stories through visuals, kind of putting an image to the voices of the communities and their material culture. So that's where I come from. I have a background in filmmaking, and over the last decade and a half, a growing interest in ethnography and ethnographic practices. So thank you all for coming, and I think I'll just kind of quickly introduce the topic. This Andaman Nicobar Collective, this is the first session of it, and over the next, and we will on a regular basis will be having various other episodes focused on specific points of discussions. For today, we thought that we should consider looking at the current pressing so-called holistic development push on the islands that is currently doing the round, and specifically on the proposed development activities in the Great Nicobar Island. With that, I'll ask Madhumita if she can kind of expand on this issue, and then we'll take it forward from there.
So thank you, Anirban. I think that one of the things that has been a cause of concern for scholars and activists throughout any kind of conversation about the developmental trajectories of the Andaman Nicobar Islands, that most of them have been considered from what is generally described as a mainland perspective. So every time there is a proposal to develop the islands, there has been a constant sort of chorus from the other side that there is also an island perspective that needs to be factored in, voices from the island particularly. So this conversation began, I think, early in January 2019. I was not a part of it, but Vishwajit Pandya was part of a committee instituted by the Niti Aayog to look into the feasibility, possibilities of developing a transshipment port in Great Nicobar. As someone, as I said, who is interested in the historical perspective of port-led development or any other development strategies, I was interested to find out why Nicobar became a point of interest for the government at that particular point. Because if you look back at the material, whatever is in the public domain, right from 2016 onwards, that the present government has been keen to develop particularly coastal cities through what it calls its port-led development paradigm. And with this view in mind, it has correctly developed possibilities of transshipment hubs in Vallarpadam near Kochi. The Adani Ports has also had an interest in developing Virinjam near Trivandrum. There is a possibility of a third transshipment port in Enayam in the Kanyakumari district in Tamil Nadu. And so the idea of developing transshipment hubs has been there for a long time, but it acquired momentum since the 2016 onwards. Now, with the particular projects in Kerala, there have been certain problems. And although Vallarpadam today, and as recently as in July 2020, has been demarcated as a priority transshipment hub by the Minister of Shipping himself, it is interesting for us to understand or to look into why, in the context of a transshipment hub already being developed in Cochin, and also one partially operational near Trivandrum. Where does Nicobar stand, and what and how it would contribute to the larger sort of interest of India in becoming a transshipment hub? Because India requires, there is a very strong case for Indians requiring transshipment facilities, because we don't have one, and we depend largely on the hubs in Colombo, in Singapore, and in Malaysia. Largely, all three hubs constitute around 80% of our total transshipment requirements. In recent times, we've tried to see whether we can reduce our dependence on Colombo. And so there was this push to develop the West Coast transshipment hubs in Kerala in particular. But one of the disadvantages which has been talked about by experts in the West Coast hubs, apart from the fact that these ports are deep draft, which also is an advantage for the transshipment hub for Nicobar. Deep draft is an advantage, but in the western coast, there is the problem of silting. So dredging costs are generally high. In the case of Great Nicobar, it is argued that the sea floor is rocky and there is less silting, and therefore dredging costs would be low. You could have large ships coming in and there won't be much of a problem. The only other issue, however, the West Coast hubs have the advantage of lying close to the hinterland, whereas Nicobar doesn't. But be that as it may, the point is that when we are presented with a development proposal like this, where we need to understand, or rather consider, both the economic possibilities and the human and environmental costs, I think it is important for us to have a clearer understanding of how Nicobar will fare in comparison to the already developing transshipment hubs in Kerala, number one, and number two, how it will be able to compete with very, very strong and advanced transshipment hubs like Colombo. How would you persuade already existing liners to detour from Colombo to come to Nicobar unless you offer them very, very attractive reasons to come to? So there is an entire area of discussion which sometimes has not been factored in the specific Nicobar proposal. The Niti Aayog, as far as I remember, had made a very strong case for the advantages for a transshipment hub in Great Nicobar. But of course, this would entail taking land, and taking land that might have impact on the lives of the PVTGs out there, particularly the Shompins. Now, I think that Vishwajit will be able to tell us subsequently how this feasibility study was carried out and how certain stakeholders' views were recorded and placed before the Niti Aayog in the form of a film, so that the government and other stakeholders could have a clearer view on what the human costs and environmental costs it might have, and therefore consider the larger economic possibilities, whether investing in such a big transshipment hub will yield the kind of economic promises, or whether you invest in this huge transshipment hub, but which is going to compete with the ports in Kerala, and whether all of this is ultimately going to, in a way, deliver what looks very promising at the moment. So I think I'll stop here and let Vishwajit introduce us to the Niti Aayog proposal of 2019 and what it entailed and what it asked you to do and what you did.
Yeah. The involvement with Niti Aayog and the Great Nicobar happened because in 2015, we were involved in trying to create the Shompin policy. what in future should be done in Champagne. And I think it's very important background to understanding the present concerns which the Niti Aayog's involvement with the development of Great Nicobar is. What we had figured out in 2015 and we had asserted, and I think Manish was involved in that policy, was the fact that nothing should be done to damage the environment or the habitat of the Champins, because of certain particular reasons in which the Champins are, or certain predicaments in which Champins are in relation to their living habitat. I'll come to it later. Once you see the film, some of these things will come out through it also. But the 2015 Champagne policy had stated very clearly that certain efforts must be made to conserve the environment which Champins live in, and also to understand and protect the relationships which are involved, which involve different Champagne groups. The Champins are not a heterogeneous, one homogeneous blob of people who are the tribals living in the central parts of the Great Nicobar. And this issue is very important to understand also their past history and the way the Champins have responded to the outside world, or why they have not. In fact, it must be remembered that always the reference was that they were called the shy Champins. You know, some of the other tribes were called as living on Andamans were called hostile Jarvas and shy Champins. Now, what were they shy of is a question. And who are they shy of, and how does that unfold, or how do we know that they're being shy about it? These kind of issues were the questions which we sort of pursued in trying to create a policy, that the policy must understand the cultural issues within the Champagne community before taking up any kind of movement. Now, any kind of development urges which suddenly people want to do, because a lot of land is there, and the new Nicobar, when the new Niti Aayog committee was formed to understand the Champagne and Great Nicobar's point of view about the development, one was told that there was a idea of trying to create some golf courses, you know, for attracting tourists. Then there was this idea that also an airport extension would be done. And then somewhere in between, they slipped this idea of the transshipment. But the main focus was on trying to develop some kind of tourism. Because that was the flavor of the month, or that was the flavor of that particular time and the politics of it. However, it was realized that it's not very easy to develop a golf course in the southernmost part of the island of Andaman Nicobar, so far away, which doesn't even have proper connectivity and still has quite a poor connectivity in terms of phone lines or in terms of airlines. And how and why would people travel all this way to play golf? You know, and the idea was that if Singapore can have it, we can also have it. So, but golf courses need a lot of water irrigation and a lot of maintenance and grass to be sort of manicured to maintain the golf courses. Now, all these issues came out in the discussion, and somehow it was sort of stifled, or it was not intended even. The main point was to create something like a transshipment area, which was the main thing. And of course, there was a clash in between the interest of the defense and there's a significant base there called the BAS. BAS base is there of the Indian Air Force and Indian Navy, and it's a very strategically important place. It still is a issue that whether the Great Nicobar could have a transshipment area, given the strategic and the international relations of China, particularly in relation to the subcontinent of South Asia, that could be open up a transshipment area. So these are some of the issues, but I want to go back to the one main thing which has come about of this project of developing the transshipment area and land to be acquired for it, for development. Interestingly enough, the document has one category inserted there, that land would be developed for developing certain entertainment zones. It's a very dubious term, you know, entertainment zones. You know, in certain ways it stinks what it can bring to it. Now, I'll get back to the issue of the Champins, which is the main focus for me at the moment. The Champins do not have territorial divisions, which are land-based divisions, in the sense, like for 4 kilometers, it's my turf, and after that, 4.1 kilometer onwards belongs to somebody else. The Champins are divided up into matrifocal groups, and they are all descendants of certain lineages, which they identify with the term Ruhi, which is the flowing water. Now, this water is a way to demarcate the territories from which they would move up and down or move across on east-west side. Therefore, along the streams, along with the main rivers, the three main rivers, Bengal, Alexandria, two main significant rivers in Great Nicobar, there are two other small streams which crisscross the thing, and they're tributaries of water. And streams of water are what the Champins use to walk along up and down the stream. Now, the territory for them is divided by the flowing waters, which is very important and interesting element, because in the rain, it brings in the silt, and that silt supports the gardens which the Champins deal. The rules of marriage, as far as we understand so far, is that you have to marry upstream. The men move upstream and the women move downstream. So a person inherits the land which is downstream, but to cultivate the land, he has to create kinship alliances upstream. And therefore, there's a connection in between the streams, and people are identified with the spots where they live along with the streams and the waterways. For these kind of worldview, or this worldview which is based on water as a demarcating line, not land being demarcated, the revenue land, the forest land which is in question, and the boundaries of it, which Manish will get into it further, are not significant criteria for the people. How do we explain the people that you will not move into this area when they have already been constantly moving around the north, south, and east, west side of the continuous land known as the Champagne territory? This is exactly the reason why Champins were at feud in between intergroup. There was a sense of hostility. So if you see the historical photographs of the Champagne huts were built on at least 15 to 20 feet above the ground. And those ladders would be removed when the other groups would invade the area to take over the gardens or to take over what they call as capturing the women. But such invasions were always, therefore, to avoid such invasions, strategically the architectural form was higher than the ground. It was not because of the rain coming in, but it was because to save the people living up, and they would pull off the ladders whenever the invasion was. Over the year, now you see that the houses have come down in the height. You know, they bring it at the most, just maintain the tradition of keeping it 3 or 4 feet high. And that architectural principle is just based on the kind of environmental conditions. But the defense or the idea of conflict in between the groups has now diffused, in the sense it is there who gets the women from which side. And there's a constant threat, which is the reason why they don't let people come up all the way in the interior forest, because they don't want to go upstream, which is the area of main focus. So there's an equation in between the land which is cultivated for mainly pandanus cultivation and the forest area which is used for hunting and trapping, to control that in relationship by creating alliances. So if you have alliances across the territory, you have kinship relations which will permit you to cross through and not, but has to be defended. Now these notions, the conflict within it, was one of the reasons why the Champins were always regarded as shy. They were not shy, but they didn't want to take people in, as was the case with all of the tribal groups in the Andaman Nicobar Islands. That nobody was open-handedly waiting for some foreigner to come in. We know in the latest case, even going back to some places like the North Sentinels. But this reason of how the land is perceived, it's not perceived as a block of land, but it's perceived as a land which is divided up by streams of water. And the streams of water are also a way to associate yourself and identify yourself as belonging to a particular clan, the word being Ruhi. I think I'll stop there and let the film speak for itself.
Shrouded under a blanket of greenery, the Great Nicobar Island in the Andaman and Nicobar chain is the southernmost landmass of India. This island is the historic homeland of two tribal groups, the hunter-gatherer Champins and the more integrated Nicobaris. Both groups are closely linked to their respective forest and coastal territories. The Shonpens, who inhabit the dense forested interior of the island, depend on the forest resources for their survival. The seasonal cycle provides resources that the Shonpens hunt and collect, like pandanus fruit, tubers, eels and other fish, and forest games like crocodiles, monitor lizards, and monkeys. Pandanus is one of the few staple food resources that is available all year round. Different pandanus variety grow in different parts of the island, and the Shonpens access them by moving through the forest and rivers. For the Shonpens, the streams form important resource zones, along which clusters of shelters are built with small gardens as focal points. The importance of flowing water can be gauged by the fact that it forms locative identity for the various groups, who are called Rui, which also means flowing water or water body. These nalas, streams and rivers are important channels of movement in and out of the forest and are used to access the resource areas, especially pandanus groves, which are spread over the mountainous and forested interiors of the island. Most Shonpens come out at certain points to interact with outsiders and with government welfare workers. An efficient system has been set up by the Tribal Welfare Department to insulate the Shonpens from unregulated contact with the settler communities. Apparently, Shonpens have a matrifocal social organization, and woman and garden are often symbolically equated in their worldview. This equation between territory and women often leads to conflict between groups and has resulted in strong territorial sensibility. As a result of this, Shonpens have fiercely resisted outsiders coming into their territories beyond a certain point. While the Shonpens inhabit the central part of the island, the Nicobaris live along the coast. Post the 2004 tsunami, they had moved inlands from their traditional lands. Nicobaris have responded to the cataclysmic changes in the post-tsunami years with the peculiar predicament of not wishing to give up their connection to Campbell Bay and yet yearning to be properly rehabilitated on their ancestral lands. When asked about development, the Shonpens were adamant that outsiders should stay away from the forest.
जंगल किनार में सफाई करोगे किनार में सफाई करके इधर बना होता है इधर नहीं तिकरीम बिल्कुल चढ़ना तो ये बोलता है जंगल सफाई करने से इधर करो नाली समुद्र किनार में कर दो हम लोग का पहाड़ में चढ़ना नहीं तिकरी बिल्कुल चढ़ना नहीं.
The Nicobaris were also not interested in any development activities on their tribal land. However, they were ambivalent about development on revenue land that did not directly affect them.
हम लोग नहीं जाता कि हम जमीन में हम लोग नहीं जाते जब टूरिज्म कि हम लोग को तकलीफ हो जाए ना बाद में से हम लोग का फ्यूचर बच्चे लोग आने वाला पीरियड को लोग तकलीफ हो जाए फिर बाद में लास्ट में इसलिए हम लोग नहीं जाते टूरिज्म बच्चे कि अगर ये लोग रोड बन गया अभी या जिंगम बस्ती वो लोग तो जाएगा बस्ती कि मतलब इधर नहीं जाता है रहने के लिए कंबल में नकाओ ठीक है. पहले हम लोग की सरकार बोला था हम लोग इधर ही रहो हम लोग बोलता नहीं जाता हम लोग अपना बस्ती जाता है अपने पहले जगह हम लोग को दिल नहीं है कंबल में रहने के लिए फिर भी मजबूरी है आना जाना रहता है.
The team also spoke to a cross-section from among nearly 9,000 settlers who are clustered along the southeast coast of the island. According to a group of ex-servicemen, what is really needed is transformation in terms of better opportunities for their children. They were in complete agreement that what were urgently needed were better educational and medical facilities, which would allow their children to remain on the island and not migrate to Port Blair and beyond. They were concerned that this outward migration would already reduce the market available for their products. They do see a resort or a grand hospitality industry as a good option, provided connectivity is brought in along with education and medical facilities. And opportunities for jobs are provided to the local population and not outsiders. They would not like the Havelock model to be replicated here.
परेशानी है जी, एक तो मेडिकल का है और दूसरा एजुकेशन के बारे में है और तीसरा हमारे यहाँ जनरेशन या उसको काम के लिए नौकरी पेशा बहुत कम मिलता है। अभी अगर ये टूरिज्म वगैरह यहाँ चालू हो जाए तो काफ़ी काया पलटी हो सकती है भाई।
The tsunami of 2004 led to major transformation of the landscape. Most settler communities moved inlands and large part of cultivable land along the coast was destroyed. In response, the government provided compensation in form of monies and land elsewhere. Today, large parts of these lands that were privately owned are in possession of the government. These areas can be easily developed without going through a cumbersome land acquisition and compensation process.
गवर्नमेंट को करना चाहिए, खाली जमीन पड़ा है उससे कोई ना कोई तो फायदा लेना चाहिए।
Potentially, the areas around Gandhinagar and Swarupnala can be used for the development of tourism. Both the locations are along the coast and owned by the government. They are well connected by road, have a jetty and settlements nearby that can supply manpower, resources and produce to the resorts. These areas also have emergency services and electricity. The two areas offer two different kinds of landscapes. While Gandhinagar has wide open beaches, Swarupnala is forested with creek and trails that can be potentially developed as places for tourism. They are close to Indira Point, the southernmost landmass of India, which can be readily made accessible for tourism as this place is marked as a taboo area by both the Shrompins and the Nicobaris. These two areas have also easy access to the Great Nicobar Biosphere Reserve and the Galatea Bay Wildlife Sanctuary. The proposed transshipment terminal east of Galatea must be moved from its current location as Galatea Bay is a globally recognized leatherback turtle nesting site and should be preserved. Leatherback turtles are an endangered and protected species and are biologically hardwired to return to the same location for nesting. A transshipment terminal will destroy this important nesting area, which by itself has a potential as a lucrative and important ecotourism destination. The team recommends, based on their conversation with cross-section of stakeholders, that development in forested area is not feasible, as both Shrompins and Nicobaris are opposed to it. The forest land and water bodies are directly related to livelihood and survival of the tribal communities. The rivers are important waterways for movement and accessing resources, and the territory and watershed zones along the river banks must be preserved. Any proposed tourism plan must benefit the local population and should not be built on the Havelock model of importing outside labor and services in preference to available local alternatives. And finally, development should be holistic and include improvement of connectivity, medical and educational facilities.
Sorry if I can just say something quickly. I think that the film actually gives a very good sense of what the problems are in that area. And I think that to some extent, Manish would be able to tell us, given the fact that what Vishwajit has already hinted at, and what is also the new sort of imperative that the administration has placed before an empowered committee, is that the ANPATR regulations, which carry the possibility of denotifying certain tribal areas for development. All it is seeking now is permission to denotify certain areas, but without much clarity as to which particular area is going to be denotified, how much of it. And so we are at a kind of an impasse. On the one hand, to give a blanket...
Just 1 second, Madhumita. Can you switch on your video, please? Yeah, sorry.
So I think that the point at which Manish can come in is the point where we are stuck at an impasse, where the government would want the experts, including Professor Pandya, Manish and others, that to give us or to give them the permission to denotify certain areas which are marked as the tribal protected area for developmental activities, but they are not clear as to which part, how much, etc. So on the one hand, there is this demand for approval for denotification. There is also this concomitant commitment that the Champins will not be impacted, but in reality, there is no clarity on as to how much land and will be required, and whether they are taking enough steps to safeguard the habitat and the rights of the Champins as stipulated in the Champin policy of 2015. So Manish, would you like to tell us what the implications of this might be?
Yeah, I'll try and kind of make it as succinct as possible, which is not my strong point. But anyway, I was able to hear what you said, Dr. Madhumita. But when Vishwajit was on, I lost connectivity, so I couldn't hear much of what he said. Anyway, to start off with, I would start with one of the things that you mentioned regarding the transshipment terminal on Great Nicobar Island, which has been planned. And as far as I understand, yes, you're right. They do want to kind of locate it at Galathea Bay, which is a world-renowned leatherback sea turtle nesting beach. There are other beaches as well on Great Nicobar, but this is one of the most important beaches for leatherback sea turtles to nest. And you mentioned Colombo, the transshipment port at Colombo, at Vidinjam, at Vallarpadam, and Thoothukudi, I think. There also is another transshipment port which India has, Prime Minister Modi had gone to Indonesia to help support and help build, which is off Sumatra. Now, by building this transshipment port at Great Nicobar, who are we going to compete with? This is a point that you brought up and raised. I think that's very important. The economics that the proposals have touted, I think there's a whole load of trash, to be very honest, because they are talking about a small island. I mean, comparatively, Great Nicobar is a large island, but it's very small compared to other land masses. And they're only talking about dredging as one of the issues. There are other issues that I'll try and bring up and highlight. Yes, Great Nicobar does have a rocky substrate and coralline substrate at the bottom, and they were against bringing the transshipment terminal to Campbell Bay, which is what we had suggested. We said that if you want to bring up a transshipment terminal, why don't you use Campbell Bay, the entire bay or port of Campbell Bay, which is a port town in any case. It is a small port to start off with. It's got a lower bathymetry, so it has to be dredged. It was the answer that we were given. But much more than dredging, which is seen as one of the major issues, there are also issues of storage. You need large land mass to store containers which are going to be transshipped across channels for markets. And Galathea Bay is surrounded by hills. It is surrounded by swamp, and it is surrounded by kind of forested hills, which has taken the government more than 10 years to even build a small road. It's still incomplete. So think about what damage or what issues will be raised in terms of an economic cost. 10,000 crores is peanuts as far as I'm concerned. 10,000 crores which Prime Minister Modi has dedicated or kind of stated for development of Great Nicobar is peanuts, because the costs are going to exacerbate much more than just clearing land and concrete structures to build a transshipment terminal. You will need storage facilities, and that's one issue. So there's no real landmass available compared to Vidinjam, Vallarpadam, or Kuchipudi or even Sumatra, even Malaysia. And secondly, that's one issue. There also are a lot of other environmental factors which have to be brought in. Do we have the capability, and we do have the capability of containing oil spills and damages or even issues that happen at sea? We do have that. So Coast Guard station will have to be beefed up. We'll have to have oil spill ships kept ready at all times. And we must remember that this is going to have this can potential not just oil spills, but just by ship traffic coming onto or other increased ship traffic coming to this island, it's going to create complete change in what washes up ashore. Currently, it is only plastic and rubber chappals which come from Malaysia and plastic bottles which come from Thailand and so on. Soon you're going to have black sand on those white beaches because of the oil that spills naturally from ships as they move ashore. And there are a whole other load of other issues. But like I told you, one is the landward issue of how much of land is going to be required to actually make this economically feasible. I don't think it is available. And even if it is available, you have to cut down huge swaths of forest, huge amounts of land. We create landfills in the Galatea river ecosystem for them to be able to actually have land available to kind of store containers. Moving beyond that, what Dr. Pandya had mentioned, as I was spoken of, the Shompen. We have met a whole range of Shompen from the southernmost family to even some of the most northernmost families of Shompen living on Great Nicobar. None of them are particularly, or none of them are not the least interested in having outsiders coming in there and setting up shop or home or factory or whatever else. And it may surprise or rather be of interest. The southernmost family of Indians who actually are Shompens live beyond the Galatea. They live south of the Galatea, closer to the Indira Point. And it is a small family. You can see in the map that I shared with all of you. And their territory extends along the mouth of the river Galatea. It's exactly where the transshipment terminal is slated to be constructed. So one can imagine a huge, complete transformation of their lives. And I've seen a recent meeting committee report which mentions that those people who have moved to they call the New Ching, the Shompen and New Chingye. And they refer to as Shompen and New Chingye. That they have no problems about it. They've moved to New Chingye and they don't want to go back to the old Chingye and so on and so forth. But that again is not correct, is incorrect, because a lot of all the Nicobaris who belong to Chingye definitely want their ancestral lands back, if not to live, to at least create their plantations. And Nicobaris are not software engineers, or at least Nicobaris in Great Nicobar, they're not software engineers, they're not manual labor, they're not people who work in shops. They are people who have lived by cultivating their crops, horticulture, and by raising pigs and chicken. That's been their form of livelihood, which they're very happy with. So even though we may see it as very rural or primitive or so on and so forth, that's a life that they have chosen. They would wish to kind of continue to a great extent, of course, with an addition of modern facilities. And like the video has very clearly stated, it is not just the Sardarjis or the Tamilian or the Telugu people of Great Nicobar who want medical facilities, education facilities. It is even the Nicobaris who want that. And Great Nicobar, Little Nicobar, the entire Nicobar district has a large number of schools, facilities and so on, but very poorly manned, maintained and nurtured. So this is again, if those 10,000 crores are spent on beefing up these existing facilities, rather than kind of pushing it into a transshipment terminal, you only need 10,000 crores. Less than 100 crores will be sufficient, more than sufficient, to develop and enhance the capability of local islanders of Great Nicobar, Little Nicobar, Kamota, and so on and so forth. Less than 100 crores. You don't need 10,000 crores to throw away into the sea and cut away land that you already have. So I think it is a huge waste of money, of public and government money, to be thrown into an island ecosystem which is already thriving with biological diversity, thriving with both cultural and social diversity on the island. What needs to be kind of come in as an input probably are other issues which have already been mentioned in the video, and a few other tweaks that can be kind of brought in. There was the other issue which I saw towards the end of the film, which where the Nicobaris who I've worked with actually for the longest time, more than 20 years, they have said they don't want tourism on their island. And I was in interaction with them for a long, long time once this entire idea had begun. When Mr. Avaradi was even the former director of the Antri, he had called me over the phone while I was there once at one point of time. And they told some of the Nicobaris who were there who told me, yes, we want to see who tourists are. We want to have tourism. I asked them why. They said, you want to see what they look like. We don't know what a tourist is. And they didn't realize that a person who's traveling, they obviously had no clue. So all they were interested in seeing what a tourist looked like. How does he look different from another human being, from another mainland Indian? White skin, black skin, brown skin, yellow skin, whatever, different colors of skin color or whatever else it was. So it was basically an issue of curiosity. And at some level, I also think that people in the administration have also capitalized on this ignorance. I wouldn't even call it ignorance, probably it's the wrong way to kind of term it, but it is capitalizing on the fact of this lack of information on what tourism entails. And they have been promised and said, you will get much better facilities, you will get much better roads, you will get better shops, things will improve. And Nicobari himself, one of the captains said, why do we need tourists to do that? Why can't they do it for us beforehand itself? Why only if tourists come to our island do we need to, only if tourists come to our island are we going to get better facilities? This is a question he raised. And I think it's very relevant, very important to kind of take this voice. When people ask, are tourists going to bring development or is the government interested in developing our island for ourselves rather than only for tourists? So tourism is kind of being touted and projected as a means towards development. When if the government has 10,000 crores to throw away or to use for development of a transshipment terminal, we have sufficient resources. We have sufficient, at least financial resources. We can develop human resources. We can develop other resources, environmental or natural resources around in the area to make life better for the people living on that island. And we're actually kind of cutting a golden goose, cutting it by its neck by doing whatever the government has planned. And I'm putting it very succinctly, very simply here. A whole load can be written about this entire program. And it isn't the first time the government has been touting this idea of a transshipment terminal. They've been talking of it for the past 20 odd years, 20, 30 years, they've been talking of it. It has only been kind of pushed with a huge kind of thrust at this point of time over the last year or two. Based on what we just spoke of, is, yes, apart from the transshipment terminal, the issue of tourism. Now, there is a map that I've shared. Will you be able to do a screen share of that?
Yeah, I'm just sharing.
And zoom into it eventually.
Yeah.
Okay, can you zoom in to towards the southern portion? Not Galatia, but just come. Yeah, move it towards the east. Come towards, move it to side. Okay, yeah, leave it there. Right. Now you see the villages of Shastri Nagar, Gandhi Nagar, Lakshmi Nagar, and the forest camp. Now, if these are all areas which are technically based on the old notification tribal area, but are occupied as revenue land by settlers. If this area was going to be denotified and re-notified as settled or revenue land, all the better. It makes no sense to be having a area demarcated as tribal land and not occupied by any indigenous tribal community over there. Can you move the cursor of the map a little further north now? Bring it down rather. Bring the image down. Scroll, yeah. Just bring it down. Get the entire box inside. Yeah, bring it down. Just bring it down. Bring it down.
On this one?
No, the other way around. So what I want you to bring is show Campbell Bay.
Okay.
Come, yeah, no, not take a second. Yeah, okay, that's excellent. Leave it there. Now look, the other lines where these two imaginary points, which are two latitudes and longitudes, which are the northern point and the southern point. Within all that area, there are Shompen actually living. Now you if you look closely at the map, the 10th kilometer is where is marked over there, and there's also a 19-kilometer mark on the road, which we actually went mapping. But all that is not tribal reserve. We must be very clear. All that land which is on the right of this red line, okay, is not tribal reserve. It is all forest land which is under the biosphere reserve and reserve forest, and there also is revenue land. But actually, in actual fact, a lot of tribal communities, a lot of Shompen inhabit that area. There are small black dots you can see. Some have been kind of arbitrarily kind of plotted based on what people have told us. The others near Lakshmi Nagar, you can see a series of 3 dots. That's where we went. Those are places where Shompen actually live. Now, those don't fall within the tribal reserve. That area has to be notified as a tribal reserve. Rather than denotified, this has to be notified as tribal reserve rather than being and not being kept as such. This is all under forest. It's occupied by different Champagne bands and clans which use these areas. So this is an important facet I've been trying to kind of press with the administration. I've written to them with the same map, with additional information on why this has to be done. Until today, I still haven't had an explanation or even a response. I've written to the Tribal Welfare Department. I've sent the letter to the Office of the Chief Secretary in the past. No one has bothered to reply, and I don't know why. And it's a simple, very clear example of showing where when a land is occupied by a particular group of people, where you actually have an intent of protecting or kind of conserving the community or helping them kind of develop, why leave this area out? This is another question I want to raise. Now, if by this re-notification or denotification, what they actually should do is, if they want to use the Gandhinagar, Shastinagar area as an area for development, well and good, do it. Those are places which are, like the film also mentions, which are places which have potential and also have local people who can benefit from that. But at the same time, one really must be cognizant of the fact that this anomaly exists in the mapping of this tribal reserve. And what is important to note is that these coordinates were arbitrarily kind of given in 1956, 1957, around that point of time, arbitrarily kind of plotted by development planners of the Andaman administration in that point, in 1956 and 1950s, saying that this is what we will declare as a tribal reserve. And this is what we will kind of use. But no one has kind of made any attempt to change that. And I tried making a start towards that, trying to get the administration to do that. To try and make a change saying, look, these lands which are not designated tribal lands are actually occupied by the different Champagne communities. Why can't we include it as part of the protective measures for their own future and their livelihoods? So I think I will end with this here right now. As we speak of the larger development plans of both the tourism and transshipment terminal, I've said what I have to say, and I can add a little more as and when we can. Thank you.
Thanks, Manish. Madhumita, are you there?
Yeah.
Your video has stopped.
Yeah. So I think that it's a very important point to sort of, in a way, move the conversation to the critical area of land. Because in any kind of developmental activity, ultimately, it is a question of land and why you want to take that particular area of land and for what purposes and what the implications are. Manish has raised a very important point over here, because these are areas where land notifications, as has been rightly pointed out, have often been arbitrary. Given the fact that land use patterns have changed, people have lived in different areas. So clearly, what was valid for 1956 may not be valid for 2020. So therefore, to understand how the Champagnes have moved, in other words, there has to be a larger, longer range study of Champagne's use of land and therefore their requirements to be reassessed again, and then figure out where exactly it is absolutely safe to do developmental activity without disturbing the Champagnes, which the government itself, I mean, anyone who can read the Champagne policy of 2015 will be very clear that the government has a very strong commitment to safeguard Champagne habitat, livelihood, and in no case that it wants to displace the Champagne. The point, therefore, now is to raise that whether developmental activity whose chief target is land is going to come into conflict with the government's own Champagne policy of 2015, and whether that conflict can easily be avoided if the developmental proposal is reassessed in terms of both economic costs as well as the human and environmental costs. Because this is going to be ultimately drive the question of development in the Nicobars for both the Nicobaris as well as the Champagnes. So that's one thing that I wanted to say quickly. But another point, which I think that Vishwajit and Anirban in particular, because we need to hear from Anirban also, that the idea of presenting a video film in place of just a text-based report, I thought was a very important one, because I don't think the Champagnes would have ever appeared, or we would have known how they used land unless we actually saw them in their particular habitat. And also to make them visible as stakeholders. I mean, the idea that there are Shonpens and they live somewhere sort of in a way an invisible existence, and the Nicobaris come or any other sort of speak on their behalf, is sometimes detrimental to not only the Shonpens, but it also impedes our understanding of the place. So I think Vishwajit had taken this idea of making a film, and of course, the carrying with it all the risks and the kind of, what should I say, the difficulties of putting it all together and bringing in the stakeholders in some kind of conversation. So would you like to tell us about how you got about it and how was done? Maybe Anirban and Vishwajit. Vishwajit can begin and Anirban can take over.
I think Anirban is the person who should respond, but I'll take it from the academic point of view. Being an anthropologist, there's always this issue that there can be multiple interpretation, and Dr. Majumdar already has hinted on it. We wanted to bring a platform where everybody's point of view should be heard. Means that is why the film is called A Land with Many Voices. We never made the Nicobaris or the Sadajis of the island talk to the Shonpen, but what do they have to say about it was clearly stated in the film. And the idea was that sometimes when people read things, it's a matter of interpretation. Especially with all due respect, a lot of government officials would not like to read something which is pro-tribal or is pro-environmental. But if you see the people themselves telling that, there's a more weight to it, there's a more weightage to it, or there's more validity to it. And that is why we had decided that we'll make a film so that the point of view of the people from the ground itself can be articulated, not that what we want to say could be then seen that we are motivated by certain interests. It also is very important to note that in the Shonpen policy in 2015, when it was drafted, we had stated that a systematic study must be continued. That has never been done. And today, that's the reason why Manish is also pointing to this issue, that the mapping of it and taking out a zone for some kind of development, denotifying that land as a non-tribal area or denotifying some places not a forest land, is not the kind of territory marking which the Shonpens deal with. And therefore, a systematic study of the Shonpen is very essential, not only for stopping the developmental projects or starting the development projects. I am not anti-development. When people do need this, the community itself said that we need hospitals and better connectivity and job opportunities. But it's not saying that we want a transshipment area. It is saying we want a hospital. And those are important issues. And before we destroy further or recreate another example of what happened to the Middle and South Andaman with the Javas, of cutting through the ATR and then now saying that, we have problem with the Java problem has not to be solved or has to be solved, we are going to create similar mistake. Last time when the East-West road was constructed on the Great Nicobar, bunch of Ranchiwalas settled and they have never moved out of that place. So you're constantly in the name of development also adding another layer of problems. Before you understand what creates the problems, we are adding more and more problems. So I think it's very concerned effort should be made to understand the culture and the situation in terms of its own social categories, rather than just bringing this over some idea from overseas that transshipment areas will bring on all the economic development. You cannot have one answer for all the places. Nicobar can never become a Singapore, and it's wrong to assume that Andaman will become like a Hong Kong. It has been an idea which has been floating for a long time, and it will never happen. Andaman is Andaman Nicobar, and it has its own distinctive characters, and we must save and protect that. Today, when they are talking of taking out certain parts of the biosphere, and it's very easy to take it out, but it's very difficult to recreate a biosphere. It's very difficult to plant a forest. It's very easy to deforest the land, but it's very difficult to create a forest. I just wanted to add that as a basis for why, as an exercise in visual anthropology and people's participation, to talk about the project, that we pulled in Anirban into this whole thing as a person who can tell the story from the storyteller's point of view, which are the people of Great Nicobar. That's all I have to say.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks, Vishwajit. So I think the objective, as Vishwajit had kind of had articulated, uh, was to kind of go into the ground, into the field, and kind of create a visual journey with the people to kind of understand where they come from, what they, when they talk about the river, what does the river actually look like? Which brings us back to this whole idea about visualization. And I think that's where my training as a designer comes in, that you use the various tools available for visualization to kind of create as accurate a picture as possible under the circumstances, so that those who are not there, who hasn't experienced it, but who will ultimately be making a lot of the critical decisions, they are able to do it from a more uh, learned perspective. And if you see, the film not only used the tool of video recording, where images were overlapped with voices, there were also tools of using the maps, using graphical elements to kind of play up on the idea of what we were talking about. And I think that has, and if not in a video tool, in various other ways, there has always been efforts to kind of use different forms of communication to kind of communicate an idea. So in this case, and I think quite innovatively, we tried to use the tool of storytelling through videography to communicate that idea. But along with that, there was this whole idea about how do we represent the voices that are already there, which the points which have been raised by both you and Vishwajit. How do you tell? Most people maybe know the name of Champagne just by the name, but they have no idea how they look, where they stay, what they do. So how do you go and kind of represent use their voices to kind of tell their story? I think that was one of the primary points that we tried to make. How do we participate with them, and how do we bring their voices to the larger audience? The other thing was that hearing and seeing always makes a difference than just reading what is written. So when you talk about a forest, when you talk about a river, but when you actually see the forest and actually see the river, it kind of may connect with you in a different manner, may kind of bring about an emotional response towards that. So that was another level that we wanted to bring about, kind of give overall view of what the place is like. It is just not land in terms of acreage or hectares, which can be converted into XYZ development project, but it is a living, breathing entity, and there should always be a vision of what you are taking away if you want to build certain things. And I think the visual medium is a good way of communicating that. One thing which not just over here, but in my various other projects, I've also found is that this kind of holds a certain degree of accountability also. The recorded voice, when somebody says something and it is recorded, it's very difficult to go back and say that, no, they have not agreed to it. So I think the voices that the community has said, the Champagne has said certain things, the Nicobaris have certain things, the settlers have certain things, are in a way statements which can be held. They as a community, as well as the government or the decision-making bodies, can be held accountable to. We can always go back after 10 years and ask them that you had demanded for a hospital, but where is the hospital now? And there's a way of accountably holding the various agencies accountable for that. I think the tool that we used for this report allowed us to kind of record these multiple points of view that came across, and to give a very complex scenario, represent a very complex scenario and a way this complex scenario could be approached. I think the very way a report is written certain times, where it's report divided into chapters and paragraphs, kind of gives a sort of linearity to the whole thing, which may kind of not allow the overall image to be clear at all the time. I think the tool of videography, tool of telling a story, and going back and forth and using visuals to kind of represent and link together different sequences allows for a more holistic storytelling to be achieved. So I think these were some of the points that we tried to bring across through using video filmmaking as a way of narrating a report rather than a very standard written report that is normally done. So
I think, yeah. So I think that we are almost kind of, I think we don't have much time anymore, but the important point is that the film actually is supposed to generate a kind of different understanding of the land, as it were. It is not to be the Nicobars or Andamans, for that matter, these extremities of India, which we see through the lens of the mainland, are not empty spaces or terra nullius, as the colonial government actually saw this. We are looking at these in the same way. These are spaces which are not only rich and teeming with life, but also these are cultural spaces where people live out their lives. Not just, for example, the government continuously tries to ask what is the extent of the land they require to sustain themselves, meaning physically sustain themselves. So people do not just live on the basis of what they eat and how they survive. There are social relations, there are cultural meanings that are attached to land. And I think it is important for us to turn away from the earlier way of looking at land in the Andaman Nicobar Islands as kind of real estate lying out there to be productively developed, but to actually understand what that land is to the people living out there and to the many other forms of life that it supports. So I think that was one of the things that was my takeaway from this particular report. So I think Manish wanted to come in there.
Yeah, one thing I just while you were saying, I realized this. See, there also was in the recently concluded committee report or other meeting that happened. I think it was the chief secretary or the Andaman administration who had mentioned that with regard to the Shompen in particular, that they are being well looked after, they're being provisioned very well, and they're all fine, and so on and so forth. If one goes to the same Shompen policy report, which all of us have kind of collectively put together some years ago, the idea is not to be able to provision and create a community who's dependent on XYZ, government or non-government or whoever else. But the idea was to, and not kind of make them independent people, but then to be able, for them to be able to hold on their own. So they are used to what they used to, they know what they know in that forest, in that entire area. So the idea was not to be able to provision them, rather to kind of take them away from dependence and to be independently capable of holding their own and to choose which way or which trajectory of change they wanted to kind of take on their own. So I just wanted to kind of make that point that when we often see a response from the government saying, yes, the tribal communities are fine, they are being provisioned well, they are being looked after well. Yes, it's true. To a certain extent, it is true. But the truth should also have, the depth of the truth should also be understood. Are we trying to kind of create a dependence of the community of being dependent and kind of being provisioned? Or are they be able to, are we allowing them to kind of survive on their own strengths, on their own skills, and to develop and take those aspects of their own livelihood forward? That's very, very important. And a classic example is even this COVID-19 pandemic, which kind of took off on a trajectory very similar to the post-tsunami response of the government of India, where after the tsunami, especially again Great Nicobar and Little Nicobar, where people were eminently capable of creating their own homes, they wanted to do it in their own way. They had to wait for 7 years to be able to, 5 to 7 years, to be able to occupy houses that the government had given them. And the government provisioned them with elevated houses, but also split families up, created a lot of discord in the entire process. It broke up a lot of social, it didn't break up completely. It created fracture lines in the social structure amongst various families in Little Nicobar, and so on. So this should not happen. So that's where I would kind of like to kind of conclude and say, yes, we have to be careful of understanding what this provisioning means actually.
Anirban, I think we will be closing.
I think we are. I think this is the beginning of a conversation, and I think we should. It's a step
Continue
one,
with it,
and
yeah.
we should continue with it because as we are talking, I think newer and newer avenues and directions are opening up, which in itself would be interesting sessions to talk about. So I think let us end the first session today at this stage, and we can reconvene back and relook at some of the issues that came up from here in the next session. So yes, so with that,
thank you.
Yes,
Yeah.
thank you.
Thank you.
Vishwajit's video and audio is off.
Yeah, thank you to Madhumita.
No, I'm on.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you, Manish.
Since we are
I
unable
think
to
we
thank you to all of you, all the people who have made working in Andaman worthy.
Yes, it's been.
Okay,
We'll
you're
be
back.
back.
Yes, we'll be back.
We'll
Like
be back again.
Terminator. So I'll share the details about the next session whenever it's convenient for all of us, and then we can decide on which topic to deal with. Maybe we can continue with some of the issues that came up from this session itself, or relook at some of the newer new issues from the islands.
And in some ways, this collective is not a closed group. There will be other people who we will try to bring in at various points to discuss some of the
You
concerns that
can
we
even
have.
apply for it.
Yeah.
You can apply for membership.
Vishwajit? So I think Anirban, you can manage that. Okay. So.
Yes. Okay. Thanks a lot, and we'll connect up again very soon.
Yeah.
All right. Bye-bye.
Okay. Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.